Hello everyone, and welcome back to another instalment of Glasgow University History Society's own podcast. And today, in a slight change of format, we're delighted to be joined by Dr Mark McClay, the department's resident expert in American political history, for a wee discussion about America's political development since World War II, to tie in with the upcoming presidential elections this year. I'm Nathan McLennan, and joining me today, as always, we have
John Hill
and Robbie Patterson,
and of course Dr McClay himself.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
So I believe Robbie has our first question, so if you'd like to...
Yes. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of recent American political history, I'd say, is when the infamous not a crook himself, Richard Nixon, was implicated in the Watergate scandal. And I was wondering what your perception is, in light of the recent election, of this scandal affecting the American public's relationship with the presidency, national politics, and trust in government.
Yeah, great question, Robbie. Thanks. So, essentially, Watergate. Let's first of all, just for those not familiar with what Watergate was, I'll just give a very brief rundown on the basis that President Richard Nixon, in the run-up to the 1972 election, formed this committee to re-elect the president, which famously went down as the acronym CREEP. And they got up to a host of dirty tricks to try and secure Nixon's re-election. And one of those tricks was to break into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, hence the name of the scandal. And some of the people were caught in the process of doing that. And what followed and what really did for Nixon and what forced him to ultimately resign and be the only president in American history who's ever resigned from the office, basically before he was impeached, was that Nixon tried to cover it up and lied his way, tried to get hush money to people to not say that the White House was in any way involved, but was eventually caught. And so essentially Watergate, as you're sort of insinuating with your question, really played a part in a profound general distrust among the American people with their government. And as you go into the 1950s, the early 1960s, there was polls that would show that if you asked the American people, do you trust the federal government, i.e. the government in Washington, to do the right thing most of the time, then they almost all said, yes, we do. Why? Our government's good. Of course we do. After Watergate, you just have a complete slide in faith in government. Now, it's not quite as simple as Watergate. You can't separate the Watergate scandal from what is also going on at the same time, which is the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War also features between both from John F. Kennedy all the way through Lyndon Johnson, who escalates the war, and through to Richard Nixon, features the president frequently lying to the American people, and later, as a result of some revelations that come out, show that they were lying the entire time. And so the combined toxicity of Vietnam and Watergate really kind of lead to this general distrust in the federal government. In terms of what immediately happens to national politics that you asked about, after Nixon leaves in disgrace, the Democrats win this huge victory in the midterm elections of that year, and they all come into Congress promising to clean things up and to restore faith in government. 2 years later, Jimmy Carter, a Democratic candidate, runs and essentially wins the presidency with his main pledge. His great promise to the American people was that I will never lie to you. Such was the faith that the Americans had in their leaders at that point. And you generally enter what is a general age of cynicism in the United States. And there's this great quote that I stumbled upon in teaching my Vietnam course, where there's a veteran called Carl Melantis, and he talks about how before the Vietnam War, or during the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson made some sort of statement about the war, and he essentially said to all his pals, well, it must be true, the president said it. And all of his friends laughed at him and said, how can you be so possibly naive? Of course the government are lying to us. And Merlanta said, quote, before the Vietnam War, most Americans were like me. after the Vietnam War, most Americans are like his friends. So it's a combination of Vietnam and Watergate, essentially, that lead to this general age of distrust and cynicism with the public.
I was just thinking, relating to this age of cynicism, in your opinion, to what extent was the presidency of Ronald Reagan in a way a reaction to the atmosphere of cynicism post Vietnam and Watergate? And do you think the Reaganites were in a way attempting to recreate some of the pre-Watergate atmosphere of trust in the position of the American president?
Yeah, that's a great point. Indeed, one of the main reasons I would argue that the Ronald Reagan ascends to the office of the presidency in 1980 in a landslide victory, and then goes on and wins another landslide, is he's an optimistic president. Optimistic about America to the point of saccharine, cheesy patriotism. You know, he calls, as my course is called, he calls it, you know, a shining city upon a hill. And essentially, Reagan, in many ways, is all about making Americans feel good about themselves, being proud to be an American once more. You know, in 1984, he famously runs a campaign ad called Morning in America, to sort of show that the nation is being reborn in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate. And to an extent, he achieves it, at least among conservatives. Sort of faith in the nation is reborn, if not the government, because the difference with Reagan, of course, is that he does not like the federal government, and famously declares so in his inaugural address. And the other problem with Reagan is that for all the good he did in sort of restoring American faith in themselves, is that with the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, which in some ways was, I won't get into Iran-Contra because it will bore your listeners to tears and confuse them, but Iran-Contra was this really complex scandal which involved a lot of money funneling to dodgy people in dodgy groups in dodgy countries. And Reagan claimed that he didn't do any of it until he sort of admitted that he did. And if he was a less liked president, he may have been impeached for it. So while Reagan goes some way to rebuilding faith in the nation, he doesn't in the government, I would argue.
Do you think that this sort of cynicism is so we've never really, the American people have never really gone back to this trust that they previously had before Watergate and Vietnam War?
In the government, yeah, definitely. They've never gone back to it. Indeed, there's like graphs you can look at, and the trust in government after Watergate just plummets. And you think, you probably thought at that time, if you were alive, well, it can't get any worse than this. And then you look at the graph all the way to the present day, and it got worse. Indeed, the only time the American people have registered an increase in their faith in government, a substantial one, was in the wake of 9/11. And that obviously has something to do with a sort of rally around the flag, you know, like trying to have faith in American institutions once again. So it's actually, in a way, it's quite a depressing story. The one of Americans and their faith in their government to do good by them, and that's true of both the left and the right. Indeed, you could argue conservatives almost have benefited from the fallout from Watergate and the loss of faith in government, because conservatism in America really doesn't want the federal government doing that much. So yeah, I guess would be I think that it wasn't a temporary blip. If anything, it's gotten worse since then.
On that point, the infamous quote from Nixon himself in the Frost report was, "When the president does it, that means it is not illegal." And what do you think the implications for this were on the American executive branch of government with regard to the future actions of Reagan?
In terms of, do you mean in terms of whether, are you sort of asking about the idea of this imperial presidency? Was that what were you getting at? So I'm not sure, just because I think I'd end up talking about things that I'll come back to talk to in the imperial presidency. So I don't know if you want me to just jump on to talk about that, or if you want to wait and come back to it.
Oh, that's fair. We can get back to that later.
It's up to you, but whichever you guys think's worth.
We'll just get back to it later on down the line.
Okay, dokes.
Okay, well, I think that's Watergate thoroughly explored. John, I believe, has our next inquiry.
So, of course, with the American election coming up very soon, it'd be good to sort of characterize the opposing parties. So, compared to relationships in British party politics, how much do you think that the Republicans and the Democrats differ from one another? Would you say there's significant differences in platform, or are there only minor cosmetic ones?
Yeah, great questions. I'll kind of take them one, kind of divide them into two there. In terms of how do the Republicans and Democrats, how are they different? What kind of parties are they? First of all, I'd say they are very different. Now, if you go back historically, that wasn't always the case. If as recently as the 1960s, even a little bit in the 70s, political parties in the United States were broad coalitions. So you had liberal Republicans in the north of America, and you had conservative Democrats in the south. You had, and essentially, you had a lot of regional quirks. You had a lot of different groups being part of these coalitions. For instance, the most obviously weird one is that you had sort of black voters as a key bedrock of the Democratic Party after the 1930s, at the same time that you have Southern segregationists being a bedrock of the Democratic Party, seemingly opposing interests going on there. So back then, you could say that there wasn't a clear distinction. It really depended on where you lived as to what you were voting for, whether a Republican or a Democrat. In terms of how that started to change, back in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, president for 4 terms, one of the most successful presidents in US history, he tries to move the Democratic Party into being an exclusively liberal party. He isn't entirely successful. He fails while he's still alive, and then he dies in office, but he starts that trend to try and sort the parties into ideologies that wasn't there before. And then you get to the 1960s, and all the changes regarding civil rights really have a key impact on the parties and who votes for them. Essentially, it's a complicated story, but in the fact that a Democratic president in Lyndon Johnson it passes the Civil Rights Act, and in the same year runs against the Republican candidate in Barry Goldwater, who's against the Civil Rights Act and voted against it. You begin the sorting of Southern conservatives into the Republican Party, and towards the Republican Party becoming a more monolithically conservative party, followed by the Democrats becoming a more monolithically liberal party. By and large, there's still nuances. But by the 1980s, you probably have parties that are sorted by ideology. To then come on to your second point, and so also I should just say as well, in terms of current times, the coalitions, the people that vote for them are very, very different. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the Republican Party now is largely, not entirely, but largely the party of older white male voters, whereas the Democratic Party is a multiracial party. And also Christianity is quite a key part of the Republican base as well, whereas the Democrats are a party of the melting pot of the United States, and also more favoured by women as well, and also tend to be backed by those that have less religiosity in their lives. To take the final point in terms of that old cliche where someone will say to you, "Oh, they're all the same, I'm not going to bother voting," that just doesn't really work in US politics, at least in my opinion just now. Perhaps if you're like a Bernie Sanders supporter who doesn't think that the Democrats would go far enough in terms of enhancing the social safety net, you might make that case. But there are just such significant differences on abortion, guns, healthcare, who to tax, how much to tax them, immigration, racial equality and how to get racial equality, gender roles, and how much the state should help poorer citizens. There's just a chasm between most Democrats and Republicans on these issues, and the chasm has been growing in the past 2 decades.
Just on that point, when it comes to the post-war consensus in the UK, at least, there was a broad sort of economic agreement between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, wherein both parties wouldn't rock the boat too far on nationalisation after a certain point. Both generally believed in Keynesian economics. Would you say that when it comes to the US, there was a separate sort of post-war consensus over there that impacted the development of both of the parties into their modern forms?
To an extent, that's a really interesting comparison. Now, essentially what happens is, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt passes the New Deal, which for the first time in American history really gets the federal government really involved in American lives, through things like Social Security, i.e. our version of pensions and unemployment insurance, through allowing workers to unionize, and through just the state essentially being seen as a sympathetic actor to Americans that are struggling at the time, the sort of basics of a welfare state. Now, what happens is that Republicans, by and large, don't like this, but it's too popular to consistently run against. And for the next 30 years, the Democrats dominate American politics, because the Republicans can't really come up with a better plan. They tend to fall back on this argument that, well, yes, we'll do all the stuff the Democrats promise, but we'll do it better. That tends to be what they say. Now, there's always, throughout this entire process, a branch of Republicanism that never accepts the New Deal and wants to roll it back, which is most evidently seen in 1964 when Barry Goldwater runs and loses heavily to Lyndon Johnson. But Goldwater is sort of an inspiration for Ronald Reagan, who will later run. Now, what really kicks off the difference and separates them out again is in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson passes the Great Society, which builds on FDR's New Deal, and along with civil rights, starts a war on poverty, gives free healthcare to the poor and the aged, spends untold sums on education, which the government hadn't done before. There's just a whole host of things in American life that expands government. And Republicans, apart from some of the big issues such as healthcare for the aged, which just have proved too popular to want to roll back, sort of rebel against that further expansion, and that helps drive conservatism under Reagan and thereafter.
Thanks very much.
I'm just going to say, related to your point about the increasing divergence of Republicans and Democrats, would you say then that in modern times, when we look at the two parties, we are not so much looking at two different political parties as two different subcultures within America, with two radically different visions of what America is and can be?
Yes, I would definitely say that. Indeed, there's this fantastic analysis done by a guy called Dave Wasserman, who's one of the key political analysts in America. And I think it was beginning in 2004, the presidential election between Bush and John Kerry. And he began looking at whether how close a voter lived to a Whole Foods store or a Cracker Barrel, which is sort of an old, like, Western done-up style restaurant place. And if you lived within a certain distance from a Whole Foods, you were much more likely to support Democrats. And if you lived close to a Cracker Barrel, you were much more likely to support Republicans. And it's getting at this idea that it's not just a political, but it's a cultural, it's an identity to be a Democrat or a Republican. It's adhering to a different worldview, in a sense. And definitely that's become a more prominent part of American politics in the way it wasn't until the last sort of 30, 40 years.
Excellent. Well, I believe we've covered that. Robbie, I believe, is coming in with another question, perhaps more contemporaneous, this one.
Absolutely. So in our recent podcast on German reunification, we discussed towards the end for a Unification Day in Germany that the mantle of leader of the free world has passed from the United States back on to a European power, namely Germany, acting as a much more responsible state in the modern world. Now, after Trump's presidency, which appears to be following a trend seen in post-Wilsonian American political theory, where they, revert back into isolationism just before the onset of World War II. Do you think that the title of leader of the free world has therefore passed due to this trend in isolationism?
No. Do you want me to expand on that?
Yeah, sure.
Of course. Please do.
Of course, yeah. Let's just move on to question 4. We've got it sorted,
Yeah, I think whether it wants to be or not, America is going to be forced to continue to be, quote unquote, the leader of the free world, which I'm sure you must have discussed in your podcast, is a bit of a problematic phrase in itself. I guess to nuance that a bit further, if Trump wins, and we are speaking just now on the 23rd of October, so we're a couple of weeks away from the election, Biden has a 90% chance, according to most forecasts, of winning. But of course, Trump has that 10% chance, and everybody's burned about what happened last time when he had about a 30% chance at best and still managed to win. But if Trump was to win, then maybe America would relinquish that title. Maybe it would be gone from the world stage, because Trump's president, he seems to have delighted in sort of poking his allies and sort of cozying up to previously considered adversaries of the United States and not friends of the quote unquote free world. And if that continued, then perhaps America's allies, led by Germany and the European Union, and goodness knows where Britain would be in this, but would start to cozy up to China as the rising power and the rising economy at this time. But America is still a quarter of the world's economy in one country, and if Biden wins, he will attempt to normalize relations with the rest of the world, I'm almost certain, and return to a sort of perhaps even more engaged policy than Obama. When Barack Obama came into office, you just had the Iraq War wasn't over yet. Afghanistan was still ongoing, and you had the Great Recession to deal with at home. So it made sense for him, I think, to sort of pull back a bit from the world stage. Whereas Biden, who is a long-standing sort of politician who has links across the world and firmly believes in world systems and institutions, I think you'll see America rejoin climate change agreements. You'll see them try and revive the Iran nuclear deal. You'll see them basically try to return to what the country was pre-Donald Trump in 2016.
And just on this point, so when it comes to the idea of a leader of the free world, can you go into perhaps a bit of the history behind the title and give us an idea about how that term came about? Because America, whilst obviously opposing the Soviet Union in the Cold War, did do its fair share of propping up fascist dictatorships in Latin America.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll be honest and open, and I don't know the history of the term "the leader of the free world." Sort of my expertise lies in sort of more domestic things, but I'll sort of happily talk a bit to the fact that I can only imagine it was, if it did not arise, then it very much strengthened in the Cold War era, when America's propaganda job, essentially, I don't mean that in positive or negative connotations, but it's propaganda job to much of the people that wanted to be allies, and the existing allies in Europe and in Western Europe, and the allies they wanted to gain around the world, and all the sort of proxy fights that the Soviets and America engaged in during the Cold War, was it wanted to win the propaganda battle. And leader of the free world sounds pretty cool. Like, don't you want to be on our team? And the opposite of that is, if you're the leader of the non-free world, as they wanted the Soviets to be seen as, then, do you really want to be on that team where they're not going to let you be free? So, yeah, I can't speak specifically to the actual where that phrase comes from, but I can only imagine it was very much strengthened during the sort of propaganda fight during the Cold War. And in terms of, you raised the point about Latin America. I mean, the ways that this was, and how America engaged around the world at this point, it wasn't just in Latin America, was, well, first of all, not to acknowledge what they were doing a lot of the time, and to keep it as covert action. But also when Reagan comes in the 1980s and revives the sort of real sort of aggression, overtly aggressive posture towards the Soviet Union, calls them an evil empire and says they'll be on the ash heap of history and whatnot, and really gets involved in Central America, he equates these pretty nasty insurgent regimes or dictatorships in Latin America with freedom. He calls the Contras in Nicaragua, for example, freedom fighters, and the Contras were some pretty nasty dudes, and talked about them being the equivalent of the founding fathers, which, if Reagan genuinely thought that, then he didn't think much of the founding fathers. And if you've ever listened to a Reagan speech, you'll know he thought a lot about the founding fathers. So, yeah, I mean, it's trying to have your cake and eat it too, essentially. So I'd say at that point.
Thanks very much.
If I might ask a point related to this, and then this may be slightly contentious. Do you think that this hegemonic status has been positive for the United States? Or do you think that America should have followed the outlook of Washington and Lincoln and not concern themselves with entanglements overseas?
Oh, that's a big question. That's a very big question. Okay. So I maybe have a slightly more sympathetic outlook than maybe if you had most of my friends that study foreign policy of the United States might have. I don't know. I think that at the end of World War II, America didn't really have much of a choice. At least that's my sort of read on events. You get left at World War II with, the US and the USSR as the two clear world superpowers and opposing ideologies. A leader in the Soviet Union in the form of Stalin, who did have expansionist ambitions. And obviously America then plays its own role in wanting to exercise its power around the world, and does a lot of bad things. There's some good stuff, but it does a lot of bad things. But I guess I always think that it's underplayed how much Europe tends to wet the bed when America wants to pull back, and that you'll often hear sort of pacifist sentiments or anti-American sentiments emanating out of European countries and our populations. But the second that America sort of starts to pull back and become isolationist, then they get criticized for that too. So it's almost because they became this huge power. I don't know if there's a world, and obviously where they do things slightly differently, where perhaps the Cold War doesn't unfold in the way it is, and perhaps there isn't things like the Vietnam War or whatnot. But I do think that for good or for ill, for the United States, and I think there's definitely a chunk of both in there, it's not able to pull back from the world stage and to be a leader.
Well, coming up next, I believe John has a question which dovetails quite nicely about this discussion of America as a world hegemon.
Yeah, really links into it. So, since World War II, do you think America has developed a sort of imperial presidency? And if so, has this seriously damaged the country's democracy?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of an imperial presidency first started getting kicked about in the 60s and 70s, sort of not surprisingly during the Vietnam era, and really became solidified by the historian Arthur Schlesinger writing a book called The Imperial Presidency in 1973. Yeah. And essentially this idea that the president was becoming too powerful and able to break through constitutional norms without any real pushback. So I'd say America's had a rise of an imperial presidency since the dawn of the 20th century. In the 19th century, you have various nondescript characters that most Americans couldn't pick out of a lineup. Who was Chester Arthur? Most people barely know. Obviously, you've got the odd characters such as Lincoln during the Civil War and whatnot, and Jefferson, Madison, Washington, all these people. But in general, the president was a background figure, not seen to have much power. Another exception might have been Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, before I forget him. But essentially around the turn of the 20th century, you get a couple of presidents in William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, who send troops into areas without congressional approval. The idea was always that, Congress should approve in war and how it was fought alongside the executive branch. This doesn't happen, and it begins to happen more and more. Then war sees a huge growth in the presidency. World War I sees Woodrow Wilson expand the presidency in numerous different ways, just in such a small, to give a small example, for instance, every year now, a president will give a State of the Union address to Congress, where he'll come to Congress and, it will be televised and he'll give a report on the nation and whatnot, and it's seen as a real prestige moment. Before Wilson, presidents just wrote to Congress because it was seen by the founders as being an exercise in sort of monarchy or, overly prestigious to do something like that. But since Wilson, they all now make the journey across to Capitol Hill and do that. World War II and the Great Depression sees this expand even further. Franklin Roosevelt assumes huge powers during World War II. And then you see it really reach zenith in the 60s and 70s during Vietnam. First, with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is essentially where Congress passes a piece of legislation which gives Lyndon Johnson scope to do whatever he wants in Vietnam. It isn't a declaration of war, which is what it should be if you want to give the president power to prosecute war. It is just an open-ended, okay, we don't really know what you want to do, we're not ready to declare war. But essentially, it becomes the basis of America fighting that war in whatever way Johnson wants. And then when Nixon comes into office, he expands this even further, particularly through deceit, by not telling Congress that he's expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia, two supposedly neutral countries that the Nixon administration starts bombing relentlessly and launches offensives into. Now, after Nixon, after Watergate, again, I mentioned all the Democrats that are elected, they try to rein this in, the so-called Watergate babies, as they were called. So they pass all these sort of war resolution acts about being harder for a president to act without congressional approval. But essentially, presidents just learn to ignore them. They find ways to circumvent them. Or they just outright lie, for instance, like with Reagan and Iran-Contra. Then with 9/11, you're getting even more executive authority here. Right before the Iraq War in 2002, Congress essentially passed a similar act to the Gulf of Tonkin, which gave Bush the power to do what he wanted without actually declaring war. And it's kind of a tale of two stories in that, on one hand, presidents have nakedly power grabbed when they've had the choice to do so. And on the other hand, Congress, which is supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, has shown a lot of cowardice and unwillingness to take political heat to make stands for or against war, and thus has allowed the president to act unilaterally.
So would you say that this imperial presidency after the turn of the 20th century sort of characterizes the presidency, the role of the president as a sort of caretaker before this time?
In the 19th century, I mean, the presidents in the 19th century were often quite bland, nondescript, inoffensive characters that just the public wouldn't really hear from them. And in the 19th century, you didn't have, it was seen as, unbecoming of a presidential candidate to campaign. So you didn't really even see them in that regard. They had other people speak for them. And they weren't, a lot of them weren't exceptional characters of their time. They were just sort of seen as next in line. And essentially one of the things is the president doesn't have that much to preside over in the 19th century. Unless you're Abraham Lincoln fighting a war, or you're Andrew Jackson and you're a bit crazy and you're trying to expand things. The federal government doesn't have a big role to play in Americans' everyday lives in the 19th century in the way that it comes to have a key role as the government grows in the 20th century.
Yeah, and that really is supported by the fact that in the 19th century, isolationism as a foreign policy was a really big sort of idea that was popular with the people because they didn't want to get involved in another European war. In the sort of after the Napoleonic period, they didn't want to just get involved in any of that. And yeah, it sort of seems like right with Roosevelt's presidency, we get him mediating the Russo-Japanese War, which sort of suggests that the US was becoming seen as a sort of a major sort of mediatory power in the world, even as early as then, before this sort of imperial presidency saw its sort of zenith.
Yeah, and I mean, what happens is, prior to the late 19th century, America isn't seen as a world power. It's not seen as a great power. It's, a new nation, one that, many in Europe, which is the sort of the grand area of world affairs at this point, sees as, this young upstart that, isn't really up to much. And France and Britain still try to mess with it often. And America essentially doesn't want anything to do with Europe for a while, and wants to just it still wants to act in, the American continent, and does a lot in the American continent, particularly, the Mexican-American War, among other examples. But essentially what happens after the Civil War is that you have the Gilded Age and this just huge growth in American business and economic power, and a lot of that, you have loads of British investors investing in it, which thus, strengthens the ties across the Atlantic. And America is becoming, it's industrialized, particularly in the North. And it is just becoming a power to be reckoned with, particularly after the Civil War is won by the North, and thus, sort of uniting the country going forward, to the point where it just naturally has more power. But it still doesn't have a standing army to speak of at this point, and its decision to involve itself in the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, and to acquire territories around the turn of the century, is hugely controversial in the United States. Sort of, splits the population down the middle on whether to do it or not.
I was just going to ask, often in America, you have conservative forces complaining about the role of big government in society, particularly since the time of Reagan. And I was wondering, during the 1980s, was there an attempt to pull back from this idea of the imperial presidency by Reagan and his administration, or did it continue on as normal?
No, I wouldn't say there was an attempt to really pull back, especially from the imperial presidency. If anything, Reagan was an ever-present in American life during that. He really was a figurehead, charismatic, wanted to be on TV as much as possible, and sort of given as much time to sort of charm the American people. He was very much one for the bully pulpit. And in terms of their actual actions, well, I mean, obviously I've now mentioned Iran-Contra a few times in this podcast, although I'm still not going to get sucked into trying to explain what it was, because, that would take a long, long time. But he does act with, and the main thing to say about Iran-Contra is that basically it completely ignores acts that Congress explicitly passes, including Republicans who support this, member of his own party, pass these amendments and legislation to stop Reagan doing exactly what the administration then does. So that sort of tells you how much, how much the Reagan administration cared about adhering to, sort of dialing back the American presidency. If anything, they pumped up the position of the presidency further, because they viewed Reagan as an asset, and correctly in terms of winning elections.
You say, in answering that question that Nathan asked, you could say that even by that time, it was a change in the sort of politics of America that it became so commonplace that it's not, you can't really separate the president from being an imperial sort of determiner, if that makes sense, as a sort of imperial figure. So it was so ingrained, it became so ingrained in this sort of American politics that it wasn't something you could so easily change, especially with the development of the media after the war and things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, to as I sort of hinted at, I mean, I sort of agree with Schlesinger's initial proposition that the imperial presidency really does start back with McKinley and Roosevelt. McKinley, because he embarks on imperial adventures, And Roosevelt, because he's the one that really figures out how to use the bully pulpit. It's the sort of that's Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin, sorry, at this point, although Franklin's very good at it as well with his radio addresses and whatnot. But and Theodore Roosevelt sort of becomes the leading character in American society, you know, in a way that perhaps presidents before him were not. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just been a long road, and I can't see a situation where a president randomly decides to step back and try to lessen the power of the office, because once you're there, you might as well, you know, in their opinion, use it effectively. There have been the odd nondescript presidents in the last 50 to 60 years, you know. Gerald Ford, you know, who took over after Nixon, didn't really stamp his authority on the office, but he was an unelected one. I think, as you say, with the media as well, the president just is central to American culture and life. Like, he's parodied whoever he is on television. You know, you talk about years of an American society as like the Reagan years, the Obama years, the Bush years. You know, it's a focal point for Americans to understand their politics and society, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
So far, we've placed a lot of focus on the powers of the president and this idea of the imperial president. But obviously, the president acts with regards to domestic policy, but private interest groups that are the backbone of America's hegemonic power also exert a large amount of control on the president. And I'd just like to get a wee eye towards looking at how historically private interest groups have influenced the American presidency in the last 50 years or so.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I would say that, you know, influencing politicians is nothing new. You know, the sort of the robber barons or the great business tycoons, however you want to characterize them, of the late 19th century, you know, played a key role in politics of the time during the Gilded Age and whatnot. You know, men such as Carnegie and Rockefeller and everything. So it's money in American politics is not something new. But yeah, definitely one of the kind of interesting things that happens around the 70s is prior to the 70s, during the era when Democrats are dominant, business, while it is in favor of Republicans generally as the more conservative, generally party more favorable to big business and whatnot, it plays both sides because it knows the Democrats are the more likely winners. What you have in the 70s onwards is that businesses begin funding a lot of think tanks and corporations begin funding a lot of conservative think tanks. They're still around today and have played a key role in shaping the conservative movement. But obviously, I mean, Democrats are also influenced by, you know, their key donors and whatnot. And the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, which I think was in 2010, which really opened the floodgates to unlimited spending by corporations, has certainly furthered, you know, at least the donations. I don't know about the influence, because one of the interesting changes we're going through now, which was first sort of pioneered by Obama, was taken up by Bernie Sanders and is definitely even being seen now by Joe Biden's fundraising, is that candidates are now able to raise a lot of money from average Americans. The average donation, that I think Biden just said it in the debate last night, his average donation has been $48. And so perhaps that will democratize some elements of American policy making and society. But I'll wait and see. You know, there's too many examples of things that receive huge subsidies in America that really shouldn't. Basically, if you're an Iowa business, you're really, really good at getting subsidies for things because that's where all the presidential candidates go first. And so all their crops get wonderful subsidies because they're a key part of the electoral process. So, yeah, I can't see money in politics becoming unintertwined in America anytime soon, unfortunately, I guess.
Well, just one final question then, and this I think takes us up to contemporary election. Do you think that the American public has become significantly more polarized in the last 20 years? And do you think that this might lead to instability in American society in the future?
Yes, American society has definitely become more, or American politics have definitely polarized in the last 20 years. It's quite interesting now that everybody refers to like sort of Republicans and Democrats as the red and the blue, the red team and the blue team. It wasn't prior to, I think it was the election of 2000 where the networks actually nailed down those colors. So, for example, Ronald Reagan would have been on one network as a blue. If, when the map gets colored in, he would have been blue and his opponent would have been red. And on another network, he would have been red and the other being blue and everything. So you didn't have just a simple sort of imaginative thing where you literally, your team has colors now, essentially, like a football team would have or whatnot. And so you have this idea of red and blue America. And I already touched earlier upon the cultural divide, that sort of Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods mentality. In American society just now, you also get, polarization between rural and urban America, with, the suburbia being the place where the battle is now happening. Although I'd say that goes back a long way. It's very exaggerated just now, but Democrats have tended to always do better in the cities and Republicans have tended to always do better in rural areas. It's just a bigger gap now. And I think also events have divided Americans. Iraq and 9/11 sort of coming along the time created a lot of division among American society. And then on the back of that, you get the Great Recession. And the end of this economic boom that had been going since the mid-1980s, which had created a somewhat placid politics whereby in 2000, when George W. Bush and Al Gore run against each other, there's not that much to choose between them on economic and social issues. Difference on culture and religiosity and the environment, but not much on socio-economic issues. The other, to think about some of the things that have been driving this, I mean, I don't mean to sound like a biased, university egghead here, but, Donald Trump is the first president, I'd argue, since Nixon, and Nixon didn't even do it to this extent, to actively try to divide the country. Most presidents appeal to unity. They try to, when they get into office, they try to expand their coalition. Who can I bring into the tent so they vote for me next time? Whereas Donald Trump has sort of doubled down on his loyal supporters and just thought, right, if I mobilize as many of them as possible, and I do this by owning the liberals and sort of mocking them constantly and firing up the anger amongst my people, so they turn out at such great numbers, then I'll win re-election. And we're about to find out the test of that theory in a couple of weeks. The other thing, though, which I think is really driving polarization, I guess it's my sort of hobby horse, and someone alluded to it earlier, is the media. In the 1980s, America still had something called the Fairness Doctrine involved. Now, the Fairness Doctrine was essentially what we have in Britain, whereby if one party went on television or on radio and made their pitch, then it was obliged, that radio station or television station, that they had to make similar time for a Democrat to come on to respond to a Republican. In the way that we have, if anybody comes on the BBC, you have to have, a Labour person, a Conservative, an SNP, whatever. Reagan administration gets rid of the Fairness Doctrine on the belief that it's always unfair to Republicans, because this idea of a liberal media has been circulating in conservatism since World War II, really, that the media in America, the mainstream media, is biased against conservatives. Now, I would say they've got a sort of somewhat of a case on the basis that most journalists do identify as liberals, and that was the case in the 1980s. On the other hand, many of those journalists would say that we are still trying to produce objective journalism. So there's that tension there. But anyway, Reagan gets rid of the Fairness Doctrine, and you see straight off the back of that, talk radio in America, just conservative talk radio goes boom. Figures like Rush Limbaugh getting millions. And you even have this case where Rush Limbaugh essentially has made a career of being a shock jock, trying to, rev up conservatives by sort of inflammatory rhetoric around whatever liberals are doing. George H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, invites Rush Limbaugh to the White House and carries Rush Limbaugh's bags in for him and lets him stay in the Lincoln bedroom overnight and everything just to get his endorsement. And so you see the rise and influence of these conservative talk radio people whose only interest is really in driving up their listenership. Then you get Fox News comes off the back of that, obviously a conservative news outlet. And since then, you've had liberals trying to balance it out with MSNBC and a host of websites which are on the sort of far left that have now emerged and backed Bernie Sanders' campaign. Some of those have wantonly, disregarded facts as well. So you have this media in America that is no longer driven by the need to educate the public as they were in the early 1980s. They're driven by profit, and the more you can rev up and anger people and divide them and confirm their own biases, the more you can get them to watch. And then we could get into social media, which is just a whole nother thing and just does that even more. But I feel like I've talked for a long time there, so I'll let you guys come in with a follow-up question if you want.
Yeah, one thing I'd quite like to ask is, so you're talking about this sort of new wave of conservative talk radio becoming popular in the modern day. Do you think that mirrors the rise of early sort of political broadcasts as seen by figures like Father Coolin?
That's a good point. Father Charles Coughlin, you might be pronouncing it right. I'm not actually sure how you pronounce his name, but yeah, and who in the 1930s during the Great Depression, engaged in a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric while also marrying it with sort of left-wing appeals to try and get FDR to do more than he did with the New Deal, and attracted a huge audience. So yeah, I mean, I suppose you could draw some sort of comparison there, and what was going on. In terms of what is sort of different now, I guess we can maybe circle back as well to where we started. And in the 1930s, Americans, by and large, trusted their political figures. Americans don't trust their political figures, and it's just Americans probably trusted mainstream newspapers a bit more in the 1930s. They don't trust them anymore. I mean, liberals trust them a wee bit more than conservatives, but not by that much. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I think it's a key point you highlighting that to raise is Americans have been polarized before. This is not new, and in fact, they've been polarized on bigger issues, and they've been polarized around whether to end slavery, whether to give basic civil rights to racial minorities in their country. They've been polarized in giving women the vote. They've been polarized during the Gilded Age in progressivism, whether over a few tycoons should run America or whether it should be, a democracy. Americans there are still key issues that divide them, and they're substantive. But there's a lot of incentives to continue to divide them more than they naturally would be in a different media environment. And just to touch on social media, since I mentioned it at the end, I remember 4 years ago when I was following the 2016 election, there was this tool which allowed you to view, and this was before sort of social media was worried about. It was a tool which showed you what the average Trump supporter and what the average Clinton supporters' Facebook feeds looked like. And they were just living in two entirely different worlds. One was just entirely, scandals about how Clinton had murdered so many people through her links over the years, and the other was, just all about Trump and Russia and everything. There was no real middle ground going on. In terms of looking to the future, which historians hate to do, but I mean, if Biden gets elected, I imagine he'll try and play healer in chief. Try and bring the nation back together. That's his closing pitch. And Biden, by personality, is that type of person. And also in terms of political and partisan polarization, more younger Americans that are coming into the electorate are registering as independents because they don't want to be part of either team. They feel uncomfortable with it. So perhaps future generations. And also social media gets a handle on the extremes that were really pushing people widely apart, then maybe there's more hope.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I think this has been a very productive discussion. Does anybody have any final remarks?
I think all my questions have been quite thoroughly answered, so thanks.
Likewise.
It's been a pleasure recording with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McClay, for joining us.
No, it was an absolute pleasure, and thanks so much for all the great questions.
And we'll see how events unfold on November 3rd. For the time being, goodbye.